Welcome to WWO Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. By the summer of 1944, Warsaw had endured 5 years of nightmare. Since September 1939, the Polish capital had been under the heel of a brutal Nazi German occupation designed to break its spirit and erase its culture. Public executions were common, food was scarce, and the city's large Jewish population had been systematically ghettoized and then annihilated in the uprising of 1943. Yet beneath the surface of terror, a secret nation thrived. This was the Polish underground state, a complex and sophisticated network with its own government, courts, schools, and most importantly, its own military, the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. Sworn to the Polish government in exile in London, it was the largest and most organized resistance movement in occupied Europe. For years, its members had engaged in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and assassination, waiting for the opportune moment to rise up and reclaim their homeland. That moment seemed to be arriving. The thunder of artillery could be heard in the east. The Soviet Red Army, having crushed German Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, was now pushing relentlessly towards the Vistula River, the waterway that bisected Warsaw. Radio Moscow broadcast messages in Polish, urging the citizens to take up arms, proclaiming that the hour of liberation was at hand. For the leaders of the Home Army, this was a moment of supreme crisis and opportunity. A successful uprising would not only liberate their capital, but also establish the authority of their government before the Soviets arrived, ensuring a free, sovereign Poland after the war. It was a monumental gamble, a desperate bid to seize their own destiny from the jaws of two totalitarian empires. The strategic decision to launch the uprising was codenamed Operation Tempest. Its overarching goal was to seize control of Polish territory as the Germans retreated, preempting a Soviet takeover. Warsaw was the crown jewel of this plan. General Tadeusz Bor-Komorowski, commander of the Home Army, faced an agonizing choice. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans in Warsaw were demoralized and preparing to withdraw. The Red Army was less than 10 miles away. To wait meant allowing the Soviets to liberate the capital, effectively trading one occupier for another. To act meant throwing his poorly equipped soldiers against a ruthless and still powerful enemy. The political pressure from London was immense. Poland had to demonstrate its sovereignty. On July 31, 1944, reports, which would later prove tragically optimistic, indicated that Soviet tanks had breached the German defenses in the city's suburbs. The decision was made. The uprising would begin the next day, August 1st, at 17 o'clock hours, designated W hour for Wolność, the Polish word for freedom. The mobilization was a miracle of clandestine organization. Orders were passed through a network of couriers, many of them teenage girls and boys. Weapons, painstakingly hidden for years in cellars and secret compartments, were unearthed. The arsenal was tragically meager. Of the roughly 45,000 fighters who would mobilize, only about a quarter were armed. Many had nothing more than a pistol and a few rounds of ammunition. Some carried homemade grenades, crafted from tin cans and explosives. Rifles were a luxury, machine guns a rarity. They possessed virtually no anti-tank weapons, no artillery, and no air support. They would face German garrisons equipped with machine guns, mortars, tanks, and the full might of the Luftwaffe. It was a fight of passion against steel, of cobblestones against tank treads. The soldiers of the Home Army, many of them university students, scouts, and factory workers who had never seen combat, knew the odds were impossible. But after 5 years of occupation, they believed that it was better to die on their feet as free people than to continue living on their knees. At precisely 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944, a city held its breath and then exploded. W hour had arrived. Across Warsaw, the simmering quiet of a summer afternoon was shattered by a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and shouts. The Warsaw Uprising had begun. In dozens of locations simultaneously, units of the Home Army burst from doorways and alleyways, striking at German strongpoints, police stations, and administrative buildings. The initial German reaction was one of shock and confusion. They were caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination of the assault. In the first few hours, the Polish fighters, fueled by adrenaline and years of suppressed rage, achieved stunning successes. They seized control of the city's main post office, the Prudential skyscraper, the tallest building in Warsaw, and crucial power stations. Young insurgents, some wearing captured German uniforms over their civilian clothes, with red and white armbands as their only identification, fought with ferocious bravery. They attacked tanks with little more than gasoline-filled bottles and hand grenades. The sound of battle echoed through the grand boulevards and narrow streets. Trams were derailed to form the first barricades. Paving stones were ripped up to build defensive walls. The initial phase was a chaotic, desperate struggle for control, block by block. The fighters were a cross-section of Warsaw's society, men and women, young and old. The Polish Boy Scouts, known as the Grey Ranks, played a vital role, serving as messengers navigating the deadly streets and even fighting in combat units. The lack of weaponry was a critical problem from the very first minute. Ammunition was so scarce that every shot had to count. Many fighters went into battle hoping to capture a weapon from a fallen enemy. Despite this, the spirit of the first day was one of defiant euphoria. For the first time in 5 years, the Polish flag, the white eagle on a red field, flew freely over the rooftops of their capital. They had risen. In the first week of August, a tangible sense of liberation swept through the insurgent-held districts of Warsaw. Polish flags, long hidden, appeared on every building. An independent Polish statelet, vibrant and defiant, emerged from the heart of the occupied city. The Home Army established its headquarters and began to organize a civilian administration. Newspapers were printed, a radio station, Błyskawica or Lightning, began broadcasting news of the uprising to the world, and even a postal service was established, using young scouts as mail carriers. For the civilian population, it was a moment of incredible, albeit fearful, joy. They poured into the streets to help, digging trenches, building barricades, and tending to the wounded. Entire apartment blocks became fortresses, their residents working alongside soldiers. These barricades were monuments of ingenuity and desperation, constructed from overturned trams, furniture, books, rubble, and anything that could stop a bullet or slow a tank. The city was transformed into a complex urban battlefield. Fighting was house to house, room to room. The insurgents used the city's sewer system, a dark and foul network of tunnels, as a vital communication and transportation link, allowing them to move troops and supplies between isolated pockets of resistance, unseen by the Germans above. The Home Army's numbers swelled as volunteers rushed to join, eager to take part in the fight. Yet the initial successes could not mask the grim reality. While the Poles controlled large parts of central Warsaw, the Germans held key strategic points and maintained control of the bridges over the Vistula. More importantly, the Germans held the airfields on the city's outskirts. The city was effectively besieged, an island of Polish resistance in a sea of German control. Ammunition remained critically low, and captured German weapons were a priceless commodity. Every day, the fighters looked to the east, across the river, expecting to see the vanguards of the Red Army. Their arrival was the cornerstone of the entire plan. But the eastern bank of the Vistula remained ominously quiet. The initial German confusion quickly evaporated, replaced by cold, calculated fury. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was enraged by the news of the uprising. He gave an order of unparalleled brutality to SS chief Heinrich Himmler. Warsaw was to be razed to the ground, its inhabitants exterminated without exception. There was to be no distinction between combatant and civilian. The city was to be made an example, a terrifying warning to the rest of occupied Europe. To carry out this order, the Germans began to move powerful reinforcements toward the city. This was not the regular Wehrmacht. These were units known for their extreme cruelty and expertise in anti-partisan warfare. The command was given to SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski. Under him were two of the most infamous formations of the war: the SS Sturm Brigade Durluanger, a penal unit composed of convicted criminals led by the sadistic Oskar Durluanger, and the Kaminsky Brigade, a collaborationist force of Russian defectors known for their rapaciousness and lack of discipline. These units were not sent to fight a conventional battle. They were sent to butcher and terrorize. Alongside these forces, the Germans brought their heaviest weaponry to bear. Panzer V Panther and Tiger I heavy tanks rumbled towards the barricades. Artillery batteries were set up to pound the city relentlessly. The skies, empty of Allied or Soviet planes, belonged to the Luftwaffe. Stuka dive bombers with their terrifying sirens screamed down on Polish positions. Most fearsome of all was the arrival of heavy siege mortars. This included multiple 600 Karl-Gerät mortars, monstrous self-propelled weapons that fired 2-ton concrete-piercing shells. Each impact was like an earthquake, capable of obliterating an entire building, turning it into a crater of dust and rubble. The technological and numerical superiority of the Germans was overwhelming. The heroic but poorly armed Polish fighters, with their rifles and homemade explosives, now faced an enemy determined not just to defeat them, but to annihilate their entire city. On August 5th, the full horror of Hitler's order was unleashed upon the western district of Wola. What followed was one of the most concentrated massacres of World War II. The Durlwanger and Kaminsky brigades, supported by German police units, began a systematic sweep through the district. Their orders were explicit: kill everyone. They stormed through streets, dragging inhabitants from their homes. They herded men, women, and children into squares, factory yards, and cemeteries, and executed them with machine guns. Hospitals were not spared. Doctors, nurses, and patients were murdered in their beds. The scale of the killing was industrial. In just a few days, an estimated 40,000 civilians were slaughtered in Wola alone. The purpose of this barbarity was clear: to create such a level of terror that the will of the resistance would shatter. Witnesses spoke of unimaginable scenes, of streets literally running with blood and blocked by piles of bodies. The Germans used civilians as human shields, forcing them to walk in front of their advancing tanks to clear paths through Polish minefields and draw fire from the insurgents. This created an impossible moral dilemma for the home army fighters: fire on the tanks and kill their own people, or hold their fire and allow the German armor to advance. The brutality was not limited to Wola. As German forces pushed deeper into the city, similar atrocities were committed in other districts, particularly Ochota. The Kaminsky Brigade became so notorious for its looting, rape, and murder that even the German command found their lack of discipline problematic, eventually executing their commander, Bronislaw Kaminsky. The Wola Massacre did not break the spirit of the uprising. Instead, it hardened the resolve of the defenders. They now knew for certain that surrender was not an option. It was a fight to the death, for there was no mercy to be expected from an enemy that saw every person in their city as a target for extermination. The battle for Warsaw had transformed from a struggle for liberation into a desperate struggle for survival. While Warsaw burned and its people were massacred, the Soviet Red Army stood and watched. By mid-August, their forces had secured bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Vistula, in some places less than 500 yards from the fighting. The sounds of the battle were clearly audible. The smoke from the dying city was a constant plume on the horizon. Yet the Soviet offensive had come to a dead halt. The tanks stopped rolling. The artillery fell silent. Soviet reconnaissance planes that had been active over the city vanished. It was a deliberate, cynical, and politically motivated decision made at the highest level: Joseph Stalin. Stalin had no intention of aiding an uprising led by forces loyal to the democratic Polish government in exile in London. The Home Army represented an independent Poland, a nation that would resist being turned into a Soviet satellite state. From Stalin's perspective, the uprising was a perfect opportunity. He could let the Germans do his dirty work for him, allowing them to eliminate the patriotic core of the Polish resistance. With the Home Army crushed and Warsaw in ruins, his own Polish puppet government, the Lublin Committee, could be installed with ease after the fact. He publicly denounced the leaders of the uprising, calling them a handful of criminals who had launched a reckless adventure. This betrayal was not merely passive. Stalin actively obstructed any attempts by the Western Allies to help. When Britain and the United States sought permission for their supply planes, flying from distant bases in Italy, to land and refuel on Soviet-held airfields near Warsaw, Stalin refused. This decision turned already perilous supply missions into near-suicidal ones, forcing the planes to make a long, fuel-draining round trip over heavily defended enemy territory. For the beleaguered fighters in Warsaw, the silence from across the river was a source of deepening despair. Each day they scanned the skies and the opposite bank, hoping for the help that had been promised, the help that was so tantalizingly close. But it never came. They were utterly alone, caught between the hammer of the Nazis and the anvil of Soviet indifference. As the situation in Warsaw grew more desperate, the Polish government in exile pleaded with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt for assistance. The Western Allies were in a difficult position. Warsaw was deep within the Soviet sphere of military operations, and they were reluctant to antagonize their crucial ally, Stalin. However, public pressure and the sheer heroism of the uprising compelled them to act. The only viable option was a long-range airlift operation from Allied bases in southern Italy. These missions were incredibly hazardous. The flight path was over 800 miles each way, crossing heavily defended German territory in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The transport planes, mostly British Halifaxes and American B-17s and B-24s, were slow and vulnerable, flying unescorted at low altitudes to improve accuracy. The crews were made up of British, South African, Canadian, Australian, and most poignantly, Polish airmen who had escaped their homeland to fight with the Royal Air Force. They flew at night, navigating by moonlight, facing a constant threat from German night fighters and anti-aircraft flak. The greatest obstacle, however, was Stalin's refusal to allow them to land on Soviet airfields. This meant the planes had to make the entire round trip without refueling, drastically limiting their time over the target. To make the drops, pilots had to fly dangerously low and slow over a city ablaze, illuminated by searchlights and crisscrossed with tracer fire. The drop zones were tiny, often just a single courtyard or street, surrounded by German positions. The results were tragic. Without the ability to resupply and coordinate effectively, many of the supply canisters, filled with precious weapons, ammunition, and medicine, missed their mark. It's estimated that over 80% of the airdrop supplies fell into German hands. The cost in men and machines was staggering. Over the course of the airlift, dozens of aircraft were shot down. For the fighters on the ground, the sight of the lone planes braving the flak was a huge morale boost, a sign they had not been completely forgotten. But the small trickle of supplies was never enough to turn the tide. The heroic Warsaw airlift was a gesture of solidarity, but it could not overcome the grim realities of geography and geopolitics. By September, the battle for Warsaw had descended into an inferno. The city was a landscape of rubble and fire. German superiority in firepower was absolute. District by district, the Polish-held territory shrank. The Old Town, a beautiful historic quarter, was systematically leveled by artillery and bombs before it fell at the beginning of the month. The fighting was now a desperate, claustrophobic struggle in the ruins. It took place in collapsed buildings, basements, and the labyrinthine sewer system. Life for the remaining civilians and fighters was a daily struggle for existence. Food was almost gone. The population subsisted on scavenged scraps and boiled wheat. Clean water was a rarity, leading to outbreaks of disease. Ammunition was counted in single rounds. Medical supplies were exhausted, and surgeons operated in cellars by candlelight with unsterilized instruments. Yet, the resistance continued with breathtaking courage. Young couriers, some as young as 10, dodged sniper fire to carry messages between isolated outposts. Nurses tended to the thousands of wounded in makeshift hospitals that were frequently targeted by German bombers. The fighters, exhausted and starving, held their positions against impossible odds, often fighting until their last bullet. They developed innovative urban warfare tactics, using the sewers to launch surprise attacks behind German lines and creating hidden passages between the basements of adjoining buildings. The psychological toll was immense. The constant shelling, the sight of death and destruction, and the fading hope of rescue wore everyone down. The sky was perpetually dark with smoke, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and decay. Still they fought on, driven by a deep love for their city and a refusal to submit. Every extra day they held out was a testament to their unbroken spirit. They were no longer fighting for victory, which they knew was impossible, but for honor and to show the world the price of freedom. After 63 days of relentless combat, the end was inevitable. The home army was out of food, out of water, and critically, out of ammunition. Their positions were untenable, their forces decimated. With no hope of relief from the Soviets or the Western Allies, and facing the imminent starvation and slaughter of the remaining civilian population, General Bor-Komorowski made the most painful decision of his life. On October 2, 1944, he signed the Articles of Capitulation. The guns fell silent over Warsaw for the first time in 2 months. The terms of the surrender were surprisingly formal, recognizing the tenacity and discipline of their opponents. The Germans agreed to treat the captured home army soldiers not as partisans to be executed, but as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. This small concession saved the lives of the remaining 11,000 Polish fighters who were taken into captivity. The surrender itself was a somber, dignified affair. In heartbreaking scenes, the surviving soldiers of the Home Army, many of them teenagers, marched out of their ruined strongholds in their tattered uniforms and laid down their arms. They had fought one of the world's great military powers to a standstill for 2 months with almost nothing. The cost of their defiance was staggering. An estimated 15,000 Polish fighters had been killed in action. The civilian toll was catastrophic, with estimates ranging from 150,000 to 200,000 killed, the vast majority murdered in mass executions. The once vibrant capital city was a ghost town, a smoking necropolis. The Warsaw Uprising, the largest single military act by any resistance movement in occupied Europe during World War II, was over. It was a military defeat, but it would become a profound moral victory, a symbol of a nation's indomitable will to be free. The surrender of the Home Army did not end Warsaw's agony. In the aftermath, Hitler's original order was carried out with chilling efficiency. The remaining civilian population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was expelled from the city. They were sent to transit camps, from which many were deported to concentration camps or forced labor in Germany. With the city empty, German demolition squads moved in. For the next 3 months, they went from building to building with flamethrowers and explosives, systematically destroying what was left of Warsaw. Palaces, churches, libraries, and historical monuments were dynamited, an act of pure cultural vandalism intended to wipe the city and its history off the map. By the time the Soviet army finally decided to cross the Vistula in January 1945, they entered a dead city. Over 85% of Warsaw lay in ruins. The once great European capital was little more than a sea of rubble. In the decades that followed, under Soviet-dominated communist rule, the story of the Warsaw Uprising was suppressed and distorted. The new regime could not celebrate an event that so clearly highlighted Stalin's betrayal and the heroism of the non-communist Home Army. But the memory could not be erased. For the Polish people, the 63 days of the uprising became a foundational epic, a tragic but glorious chapter in their long struggle for national identity. It represented the ultimate sacrifice for freedom and independence. Today, a rebuilt Warsaw stands as a monument to that spirit. Every year on August 1st at 5 p.m., sirens wail across the city. Traffic stops, pedestrians stand still, and for 1 minute of silence, Warsaw remembers its heroes. The uprising remains a powerful and poignant story of courage against tyranny, of hope against despair, and of the terrible price of betrayal. Thank you for joining WW Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.